Joining us now on The Debate, Sid Ryan, President of the Ontario Federation of Labour, Charlotte Yates, Dean of Social Sciences at McMaster University, James Milway, Executive Director for the Institute for Competitiveness and Prosperity, and Howard Levitt, employment lawyer and columnist with the National Post. And it's good to have everybody around the table. Nice to see you all again. First time for you, Howard.
It is.
Nice to see a couple of Hamiltonians getting on so well here,
Fantastic.
Eh?
Actually,
right.
three.
Three. Well,
That's true.
now you're not from Hamilton, though, are you?
No, but I've been there.
But you're at Mac
I've been
for-
there probably longer than you have been gone. So you
That's
see,
possible,
in
you know?
that sense, I may be more of a Hamiltonian.
Okay. You know what I like to do, just to get Sid really into the program here, I like to quote his favorite columnist from the National Post. That's Terence Corcoran.
Oh, my God.
So we'll quote Terry, and then we'll come back with a question for Sid. Here we go. Michael, shall we? Whether public sector workers in hospitals, transit systems, education actually want to be members of unions in Canada is a question that cannot be answered. Government jobs are almost 75% unionized, and nobody has a chance of getting out of the unions. Across the country, from the Canadian Union of Public Employees, that's Sid's former, to the Provincial Teachers Union, to all the other government employee groups at national and municipal levels, the big government unions have a hammerlock on workers and taxpayers. That entrenched control over government monopoly services, embedded in law and policy, puts Canadian union leaders in the feather-bedded, gold-plated driver's seat of public sector operation and fiscal policy. Is Sid having a heart attack yet? I'm just looking. As a result, there will be no Wisconsin-style move to rein in union power in Canada's provincial capitals or in Ottawa, no matter how bloated the union pension plans may be or how great the disparity between the wages in the public and private sector. I imagine you don't agree with a heck of a lot of the setup, but let's go to his conclusion, which is essentially that, I guess, Canada in general and Ontario in particular are immune to what's been going on in Wisconsin. What do you think of that?
I don't believe that at all.
Really?
I think the right to bargain collectively is probably not in jeopardy, given that it's a charter right and because of the high unionization rate in the public sector, for example, 75%. I do think, however, there are elements of rights that unionized workers have got can be undermined. For example, we've just seen it just last week, where McGuinty essentially has legislation in the Parliament right now to remove the right to strike from TTC workers.
Toronto Transit.
Exactly. So in many respects, the right to strike is the fuel that sort of energizes the collective bargaining process. That's what drives the bargain.
So not Wisconsin, but Wisconsin light, maybe?
Yeah, you could see elements of it. You know, the Ford, so-called Ford Nation, you know, they're trying to pick up on elements of Wisconsin. But I don't think you'll see the full-blown attack, for example, taking away the RAND formula, which is the, you know, what you see in Wisconsin on the surface is only just about that. Behind it all, taking away the right of workers to payroll deductions, for instance, which prevents unions from engaging politically.
Okay, I
think is a big problem.
I should ask Charlotte. Give me 30 seconds on the RAND formula, because Sid described it in one way, but I think some people may quibble with that description.
It's the automatic checkoff of dues.
Automatic checkoff, but it's also, you don't have a choice. You have to do it, right?
No, it's true, although you can opt out for certain charter reasons, but it's true. But on the other hand, the right is protected. It's been protected because, in fact, it's argued that workers have already made a majority decision to support the union, and it seemed to stabilize the collective bargaining arena. So
and it's been that way for 40 years anyway.
Well, for 40 years, there was an attempt in a number of provinces to encroach on that right, and then that was pushed back. So in that sense, I think the RAND formula has been pretty secure.
Okay.
So
Give me
far.
your take, Charlotte, on whether or not you think what's happening in Wisconsin is transportable to Ontario.
I agree with Sid to some extent. I think that perhaps some of the more extreme measures that we're seeing in Wisconsin may not be. But having said that, if we look at the last 20 years of collective bargaining in Canada, public sector unions have had their right to strike removed. They've had their right to collective bargaining retrenched. They've actually had restrictions put on joining unions. So in a sense, it's not so long ago that we saw many of these restrictions. So I'm a little bit more cautious to say that all of those rights are protected. And that's where the rights of Wisconsin workers say are now, I suppose, in the hands of the legislature, but also in the hands of the mobilized protesters who have done an incredibly effective job at least galvanizing some public opinion and support.
James, what do you say?
I think with the group here, I think it'll be a Wisconsin light. I think what you may see in Ontario more so than Wisconsin is, rather than taking away rights through the legislature, there may be a greater willingness to confront unions through the bargaining process. I think the public would be supportive of a government that says we're going to hold the line on public sector wages and pensions and benefits. I also think what you have in Wisconsin, which doesn't apply here, is that you have the political differentiation. The Democrats are very much with the unions, the Republicans are not. I think one of the things that's going on in Wisconsin, I think a secondary factor in all of this is that by restricting the power of unions and their ability to raise money, that is a political opportunity for the Republicans at the expense of the Democrats. We don't have that situation here in Ontario.
We don't?
Well, we have a party that supports, that is very much connected. And
we have, hang on, let me just check. We have the NDP,
right,
which is very much with
connected
the unions.
With the but
we have the Liberals, who have been very cozy with the unions for the last many years, and who are being, you know, Working Families Coalition is essentially a union-backed project,
right,
working for the Liberals.
I don't think that's going to go too far. If it does go as far as you might be making it out to be, then I think you may have the conditions in Wisconsin applying here. But right now, the NDP is essentially the party of Labour, give or take, and they are not a serious threat to form the government. And so I don't think one of the two major parties is going to be doing anything against the unions so that they can block the NDP.
Okay. Howard, your view.
Stephen, you're an average worker in Ontario or anywhere in Canada. You see, someone doing the same job as you with benefits making 42% more federally. Municipally, 32% more. Your taxes are going up. You're unable to afford the lifestyle you used to have or to look ahead for your children. And you say, why should I be paying as my employee 32 or 43% more for this person who's on my payroll as a taxpayer? And they're outraged.
What?
And that's ultimately what Ford Nation is all about. And in that last garbage strike in Toronto, the citizens were enraged. They were apoplectic that Miller capitulated at the end. They would let them hold out forever, and they'll do it again. And they want contracting out, and right now the law doesn't permit that.
I think where Howard is going off the rails there is he's playing into what I refer to as the politics of envy. You know, we need to be appealing to people at a better level than this base level that you're appealing to them at. We need to be saying to those folks, and there's lots of them who don't have a pension plan, for example. It's part of the reason why the Labour movement have engaged in this expansion of the CPP, where we recognise that there are a whole lot of folks out there who don't have a decent pension plan. So rather than saying, let's take it off of public sector unions, everybody should be striving to say, I ought to have a better pension plan as well. And if the Labour movement can help to expand the CPP, where everybody can have a decent pension and I'll retire with dignity, that's a better solution than the stuff that Howard is peddling, which is the politics of envy.
But we can't afford it.
How about this as a follow-up? Yeah, let's take your premise as a given. Why do you think people say, I refuse to finance that any further? Why don't they say, that looks pretty good, how do I get there?
Because we can't afford it. You know, the deficit is $19 billion higher than it would be if public and private sector workers doing the same jobs made the same amount of money.
Howard,
they can't afford it.
Expanding the CPP does not add a single cent to the deficit. It doesn't come out of government coffers. It comes out of employers and employees. Not a penny comes out of government.
It's certainly not good. Expanding the CPP certainly isn't going to equalize public sector wages.
The deficit, you can't blame the deficit on public sector workers. That's a real sleight of hand, because in fact the deficit is related in part to the 2008 recession, which is in fact because banks were so unregulated and unable to make the kind of deals they wanted, which caused a collapse in the economy. So there's been a collapse in revenues. It's not because public sector workers are paid too much. That's a real sleight of hand to suggest that. But in fact, if we add on to that this notion that you want to drive everyone's wages down to the kind of basic minimum, what we really can't afford in the country is to allow a growing number of working poor, because we know that as the income gap grows, health outcomes decline for everybody, including the middle class. Crime rates go up.
Okay, let me get James, though,
quite
on
frankly,
your initial...
if I can just add on to this, what we haven't talked about is the attack on the public sector workers is largely attack on female workers.
Okay, hold off on that, because the first part of that answer you said you cannot draw a line between the size of our deficit and what we're paying our public employees. And I want to know, James, if you agree with that.
I think you're right on the trajectories, but if you're in government and you've got a deficit to deal with, you've got to look at, well, how do I cut spending? And you've got a big wage bill there. It's a fact of life that the biggest expense for governments and for most companies is the wage bill, so you got to look at that. And I think, you know, Howard raises a good point. Rightly or wrongly, I think the public is looking at, gosh, these government workers seem to be getting a good pay, they're getting a good pension, they can retire early, that's all true. That doesn't seem right. I think, so I think the public sentiment is certainly there for a government to say we're going to take on the unions.
Well, here's the problem with the government. The Ontario government came to the public sector unions in particular just a few months ago and said, we want you to implement a wage freeze on a voluntary basis. And we said, okay, you have a revenue problem. They said, yes, we have. Why then are you giving $2.4 billion out to the corporations who are already doing very well in this economy? Why are we giving them an additional $2.4 billion in tax cuts at the same time as you're coming to public sector unions who earn a modest wage, by the way? It's not a great wage. Like, as you go and talk about childcare workers, social service workers, associations for community living workers, they're all about $12, $13 an hour. And a lot of them don't have a pension plan. There's a misnomer out there that somehow everybody in the public sector has a pension plan. They do not. And many of them earn very low wages. So to go to those workers and say, we want you to take a wage freeze, at the same time hand $2.4 billion into corporate tax cuts over to an already healthy private sector, to us didn't make sense. And we said, sorry.
What's James's position on that?
Well, I know this isn't about corporate taxes, but you raise the issue. I think what the feds and the provincials are doing is getting our corporate tax rates down to a point where we will get more investment and we will get more jobs and better paying jobs.
Ireland tried that and they're now bankrupt. Ignatieff, though, is turning around and he's criticising.
That's right.
He's criticising Harper, and McGuinty is turning around in the same Liberal Party, albeit at the provincial level, and he's saying, "Oh, we think corporate tax cuts is the way to go." So who's right? Is Ignatieff wrong and McGuinty
yes, Ignatieff's
right?
wrong. Corporate tax,
so?
and well, he's wrong today. He was right 6 to 9 months ago when he was in favour of corporate tax reductions.
But Flaherty was peddling the Irish model only like 6, 7 months ago.
Okay,
and now they're a basket case.
We can cherry
pick
pick numbers left, right, and centre around corporate tax cuts, and I'm happy to turn this into
but
a corporate tax.
it's part of this equation, though. You
I
can't,
don't
this is
think
what the
it is.
right wing wants to do all the time.
Time out,
It's like
guys. Howard, come on in.
Thank you. Well, the reality is the provincial government in Ontario is moving increasingly toward bankruptcy. The deficits are unsustainable. So McGuinty said, we need a 2% wage cut because compared to the private sector, the taxpayers, they're overpaid. So what did he do? He imposed unilaterally a wage cut on non-union workers, which he could do legally. And what did he do with not the low-paid dishwashers and daycare leaders?
Do it for everybody.
The OPP, he said it for everybody, but then he turns around and gives the OPP and the Crown attorneys, the first two out of the gate, massive better collective agreement advantages. I mean, it was entire hypocrisy. He did a backroom deal at a Toronto hotel.
What should he have done?
He should have. He can't impose it because of the Supreme Court of Canada case in BC Health. But he could have negotiated a lot harder, and at the end, using the BC Health model, then imposed it.
Well, that was BC. I mean, there's a lot of people who say, you know, this is Ontario, that's BC. He could have passed, if you really wanted to hold the line on salaries here to avert potential Wisconsin-like, you know, drama in the future, pass a law saying everybody gets nothing this year.
That's the problem. That's the BC Health case. It says you can't just do that.
Well, that was in BC, though.
No, but it's the Supreme Court of Canada. It covers Ontario.
But
Go ahead.
I think the point is that the Liberals here, if we're talking about the politics of what's going on as opposed to the economics of what's going on, the politics is that the Liberals are trying to hold that middle ground. They don't want to legislate wage freezes, even though they actually want the outcome of a legislated wage freeze. So they've been caught between the politics of a kind of brokerage politics, which really hasn't worked for them in this case. And I think, to some extent, I think Jim's right, that there is an element of need for Labour to say in public sector will come to the table, but what the reality is that Labour has come to the table and said we will do all kinds of things because Labour's not interested in, there's no bankruptcy of the province, that's an overstatement, but certainly Labour understands in the public sector as well as in the private sector that they need to bargain responsibly, and that's exactly what they've done.
No bankruptcy, Charlotte, and no unemployment either. I mean, that's the other thing. The unemployment rate among publicly paid employees is virtually nil. It's not the same as the private sector, obviously.
No, but I mean, that also is a bit spurious because if you look at the trends in the public sector, contracting out is much greater in the public sector than it has been in private sector countries. You've seen a lot of kind of pushing downwards of wages. So we look at a large number of public sector workers who work in that sector of the nursing homes, for example. Again, all women, largely immigrant women, low paid. They've got some rights through unions. They were going to be covered by, they were some of the anticipated targets for this wage freeze. So in that sense, okay, let's look at, we want to solve a public financial problem, but to suggest that you do it by, on the backs of public sector workers only, is just not
And who's
feasible.
suggesting that? Nobody's suggesting it's on the backs of public sector workers only.
That
There's
is
a whole
what
bunch of
Wisconsin,
solutions.
and that is what Howard is suggesting, that Labor does actually have to, that we have to lower public sector wages down to those of the private sector. If we do that, on average, then in fact you're going to drive up rates of poverty. You're going to increase rates.
Can I just be clear?
Because
Let me just
public
be clear.
sector
Can I be
workers
clear?
are dramatically overpaid.
But is that what in fact you're saying? That we need to have a pay cut right now for many publicly paid employees?
I would think that we should have a pay cut for many publicly paid
seriously,
hang on,
employees.
let him make a point.
That's a difficult thing to accomplish. So what is more realistic is their wages simply frozen, and maybe some of their benefits get reduced, as we had the fight in Toronto over the sick pay bank that they got to cash out when they were ultimately retired.
The outside workers.
The outside workers, yeah, the garbage workers and the outside workers. So we could cut out some of the benefits, which make up most, in fact, of the premiums compared to the private sector. Because ultimately, we're in a free enterprise society. There's no good logical reason or good economics in overpaying relative to the market public sector workers, and there's certainly no good economics in not allowing us to contract out.
Just to have a second. So dealing with sanitation workers, already in the city of Toronto, we had the great comparator, which now Ford is trying to implement. Underneath Miller, we've had York Region was contracted out to the private sector, and you had the rest of it basically, except the Etobicoke, was done publicly. They did a comparative analysis between the cost of the garbage collection in both of those jurisdictions, and they actually brought it in-house away from York Region because it was cheaper to do it in-house. The only difference between the private and the public sector, wages of workers go down, granted, but the profit margin remains the same. You sell off your rolling stock, and then so you come in with a low ball bid to get the contract, and then the private sector turns around over a number of years and starts to jack the rate up, and there's nothing you can do about it because you've sold off your rolling stock. To get back into that business again, you're going to have a massive investment.
James, and then I'm going to quote the New York Times.
You're right. That is a problem with contracting out, is that it's almost a point of no return because you do get rid of your rolling stock. But, I mean, life's unfair. All corporations, all entities have this situation where they make decisions and they have to decide, I'm going to contract this out, and if it doesn't go the way it's going to go, it doesn't go the way I wanted it to go, then I change. And so I think one of the challenges we have with public sector unions is that we build in this inflexibility, that we're stuck this way forever, and that if someone suggests a different way of doing things, like contracting out in Toronto.
Didn't we just do that in Toronto, and actually in Ottawa? We actually made the case that to contract it in is far superior, and cost savings, like in Ottawa, in the case of Ottawa, $7 million a year they saved by contracting it in. Right. So where's the inflexibility in that? You sit down with the union and negotiate with them and come up with different, better ways of doing it. It's a far better solution than paying somebody $12 an hour with no benefits.
No, but, so I think we're in violent agreement. If the public sector unions are part of the opportunity for contracting out, so if they're one of the people that are bidding on this contract, then that works for me. I mean, I think I would very much like to instill as much competition as possible into everything we do, because I think competition brings out the best and makes us more innovative, gets our costs manageable.
Okay, let me get it.
We're getting too far behind here, and I want to get to this. Here's the New York Times. You'll like them better than the National Post, I suspect. Here's, Michael, let's bring up this graphic. It is impossible to bargain collectively with the government. That's the quote. That wasn't Newt Gingrich or Ron Paul or Ronald Reagan talking. That was George Meany, former president of the AFL-CIO, in 1955. Government unions are unremarkable today, but the labor movement once thought the idea absurd. Public sector unions insist on laws that serve their interests at the expense of the common good. The founders of the labor movement viewed unions as a vehicle to get workers more of the profits they help create. Government workers, however, don't generate profits. They merely negotiate for more tax money. When government unions strike, they strike against taxpayers. FDR considered this unthinkable and intolerable. Okay, Charlotte, to you first. Should public sector unions have the right to bargain with the government?
Absolutely. In fact, a lot has changed since 1955, not the least of which is we had a very, very small and, in fact, highly paternalistic public sector in the 1955. And then, of course, with the expansion of the welfare state, we've had an expansion of the public sector. And with that, we've got large, what are effectively corporations, hospitals, universities, various parts of the public sector where you have thousands of employees. And it's not up to the government to unilaterally decide whether they will be paid today this amount and this amount tomorrow. But in fact, collective bargaining is very much a part not only of the rights of employees, but it's a critical part of civil society. unions are a critical part of our civil society. They're part of not just giving voice to workers, allowing them to bargain the working conditions. And it's true that the dynamic of bargaining is different in the public sector than the private because you don't have the profit motive. But you also don't have, government itself has also far more powers with regards to workers. Private companies can't legislate workers back to work. Private companies can't, in fact, take away the right to strike. So,
And the government can't go out of business.
Exactly. So, in a
Okay,
sense,
Howard?
the dynamics are fundamentally different.
No, they shouldn't. But I don't see that happening. Obviously, they're going to allow continued collective bargaining in Canada. But the reality is this, and this is the source of the whole problem. If you're in the private sector, if you're at a convenience store and there's a strike, customers will just go elsewhere. At the end of the day, ultimately, the employees and the union can't put the employer out of business. They'll lose their job. There's a rough equilibrium. But there's no market discipline like that respecting the public sector. There's nobody on the other side who stands to lose their own money. The politicians are generally, unlike the recent Toronto garbage case, much better off just to capitulate, which is why every single year, historically, the public sector does much better than the private sector. It's easier for the politicians to just give them money. It's not their own money. And they avoid an embarrassing strike, and by the time the proverbial, hits the fan, they're out of office anyway, and they bear no responsibility. And if they bear no responsibility, then they make the wrong decisions. And that's the problem, and that's why the public sector gets these elaborate benefits, particularly because there's no one looking at the benefits. They can say they got 3% wages, that's higher than everybody else, but it's not that much higher. But all of the other benefits that no one else has that we're paying for and we're having an increased deficit as a result of, they're invisible to most people.
James, you share that?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a challenge of how do we deal with public sector and public sector unions. I think there's an economist, Janos Kornai, coined the phrase soft budget constraints and hard budget constraints. The private sector, most private sector firms have competition so that if their costs get out of line, they're going to be, they're going to be disciplined by the marketplace. And the challenge we've got in public sector, rightly or wrongly, is that in many cases there is no competition, there's no competitive discipline. And I don't know if I'd go as far as Howard on this, but I think politicians don't have the same discipline being foisted on them as a CEO of a corporation who has to worry about the Japanese.
But they do like to get reelected, and one way you don't get reelected is by giving away the store, right?
Until now, that doesn't seem to have been a major issue, and I think that's where things may be changing. I think
someone has to
Canadian
know you.
labor.
Someone has to know you gave away the store.
Part of the problem is that when it comes to a strike, generally speaking, in the public sector, they're relatively high profile. So the garbage collection, sanitation issue. By the way, there were 35,000 people on strike. 300 of them are sanitation workers, and the whole focus was on the sanitation workers, not on the other 35,000 workers, right? So the problem is 98% of all collective agreements, of all bargaining, private and public sector, are actually settled without a dispute. It's those one or two high-profile disputes that allows Howard to write his columns, which talks about take away the right to bargain from unions and trash public sector unions, let's get rid of them, when in actual fact, a tiny, minuscule number of strikes actually emanate in the public sector as a result of collective bargaining.
It's not the strikes, it's the giveaways.
It's not the giveaways. No,
it's
when
the
you
giveaways.
Okay, here's why Duncan, the Minister of Finance, backed away from the wage freeze. He discovered when he actually began to track the public sector versus the private sector, 1.6% was the annual increase over the last number of months of the settlements in the public sector versus 2.2% for the private sector. So the whole premise for asking for a wage freeze, so as we would suffer the same amount as the suffering in the private sector, was blown away.
That's one anomalous year. The increase has been much
higher.
higher.
It's not.
Let me try this with Charlotte. Canadian public sector unions, I think it's fair to say, are viewed by much of the public as being very powerful. They do have the ability to, if not shut the government down, then at least make life for citizens dramatically more inconvenient. Does this create an antipathy, do you think, by members of the public for the union movement, public sector union movement?
It depends how unions play it. And one of the things that public sector unions are very aware of the fact that they are not only just paid by the taxpayers, what we forget is they serve the public. And many of them are very committed to serving the public. The police, the nurses, the nursing home workers,
Teachers.
all of these people, teachers, people I value, people we all value, but also they value their relationship with parents, with patients, and so on. So in that sense, that is always and always has been a constraint on unions. So that yes, there are times when that antipathy can emerge, but unions are very conscious of that and work very hard. If you look at the elementary teachers' strike, in fact got widespread support from parents because they worked very hard to both, they were bargaining for their rights, but they were also bargaining for improvements to classroom education for our children. Similarly, nurses have often, when they've gone on strike, or they've at least bargained when they've hit into tough bargaining. It's not just about themselves, it's about making sure that the public service they provide is in fact protected. So unions are very conscious of that kind of coalition building.
You used to lead a union. You used to lead CUPE. Canadian Union of Public Employees, and you told us many times that all of the high-profile settlements and the people that we talk about making 100 grand a year, those weren't your people. Your people were out there making 25, 30, 35,000
Absolutely
a year.
not. And a great example of this is recently the Toronto Housing Corporation. You know, Ford made great hay out of the fact that these people were off and having spas and Belgian chocolates and so on. I can assure you, it was not the plumber in the Toronto Housing Corporation that was off in a spa. It was actually management. It was part of that was actually privatized. It was privatized managers that they brought in to manage the system are the ones that were gorging at the trough.
But do unions occasionally misplay and overplay their hand, resulting in this antipathy from the people they purport to serve?
No question about it. Both the strike in Windsor and the strike in Toronto, you know, were public relations disasters for CUPE, and I fully admit that. And there were mistakes made. But believe me, as Charlotte said, we will learn from those mistakes and rebuild the public image in terms of how we conduct strikes. And by the way, too, people are taking a serious look at, even in the public sector, how effective are strikes, and see if there's other mechanisms where we can put some pressure back on the employers and at the same time maintain public support. So there's all of those issues, believe me, are being looked at, and there will be a reinvention, if you will, of the public sector in that respect. There's a lot of people taking stock of what happened a couple of years ago.
Okay, let me try this now. Sorry again, Sid. Financial Post this time. Here we go with this one.
You're a lucky guy, Sid.
On the hot seat, okay.
We hear from the Guardian.
Yeah.
Michael, top of the page. The atmosphere for public sector workers is going to be unpromising, says Brian Lee Crowley, Managing Director of the Macdonald Laurier Institute. That's an Ottawa think tank of the coming vote in Ontario. Quote, you're going to find parties will make political hay out of the fiscal decline and point to the growth and the size and cost of public sector as a key factor. We will see if the electorate will go for that, but given the current context, I can't imagine this will not be part of the campaign. Now, admittedly, the immediate future is focused on the federal campaign, but we are less than 200 days away from an Ontario election, and once this federal business is out of the way, the focus is going to be on Queen's Park. As a result, I'm wondering how much all of you here think, I don't know whether I should call it an attack or a focus or what. Let's call it a focus, Howard, on public sector unions and how they are compensated and what rights and what powers they do have. How much of a feature of the upcoming provincial election campaign is that going to be?
If the Tories played it right, they can make great hay over it.
What does that mean? How does playing it right mean?
They would talk about what I explained a moment ago about how McGuinty said one thing and did precisely the opposite and gave dramatically massive increases to certain sectors. And of course, once he gives it away to the OPP and the Crown attorneys, how can he go to the lowly paid, the immigrant women, and give them any less? He can make great hay over that. He says one thing, he does another. The second thing he can talk about is the compensation difference between public and private sectors, and talk about that as one way to get down the deficit. After all, most of the public sector unions support the NDP, so he's not going to lose a lot of support that way.
So if you're Tim Hudak, you want to run an election campaign on the politics of envy? Is that what you're saying?
I think it's one aspect of obviously a broader campaign, but it would get a lot of support. It's a little bit like Harris did some years back in terms of getting a lot of support over overpaid individuals on welfare and
Jim,
otherwise.
you want to play it that way?
Well, I think politically you're right. I think if you're advising the Tories, you'd say go after the unions. I think there's some political hay to be made, as the quote told us. And you know, you can talk about pay and you talk about strikes. I think my challenge with the problems we have, I think, with unions is way more inherent in that, you know, do we have competition? Do we have innovation? Are we pushing our managers and our workers to come up with the most innovative solutions? And I think that's where you build too much inflexibility. But in terms of the politics, oh yeah, I think the politics of envy or anti-union, I think that makes a lot of sense.
And this is where we get back to the question I asked before. If Tim Hudak, and we don't know yet, he hasn't put his platform out, but if he decided to make reducing the public service a significant part of his platform, unions could, again, overplay their hand and end up at the end of the day.
I don't think so. I think he'd be toast, to be very frank about it. And it's part of the reason why both of these gentlemen are not advising political parties. You know, 75% of the public sector are unionised. That's teachers, firefighters, police, nurses, you know, sanitation workers, municipal workers.
Television hosts.
Television hosts, you got it. Hugely influential in the electoral politics in Ontario. Nobody is going to go out there and alienate that group intentionally. Maybe after, like Harris did, after he got elected. Harris was very clever. He never showed his hand all the way through the election. Once he got his majority government, then he came after the teachers and the other sort of unions.
He promised to reduce the size of government.
Not to the degree that he did, and not in the way that he denigrated school teachers, for example. 250,000 school teachers. Do you think that Hudak is going to come out? He's bending over backwards right now to pretend.
Teachers.
Yeah, exactly. But he's bending over backwards to run away from that. That's why the Working Families Coalition are reminding the public. Remember what it was like when Harris was in office. Record number of days lost due to strikes. You know, teachers walking out of the schools. Turmoil in the province. Nobody's going to run on that kind of a platform. So I disagree.
But Charlotte, we have, for better or for worse, we have paid for labor peace. We have not lost the kind of, you know, Mr. Harris, I remember, came to power in 1995 pledging that not a single blade of grass on the south lawn of Queen's Park would be untrod upon by demonstrators. And he was good on his word. Every blade of grass was trod upon by demonstrators. But,
would we want to go back to those days?
There is a chunk of the electorate. Last I checked, Mr. Hudak was clocking in at 44% public support that think maybe government's too big, settlements have been too big, we need to rein things in. Concerned about that?
I think to suggest that the reason why Tim Hudak is running at that percentage is strictly because of public sector unions or because of government, I think is ludicrous. There are so many other issues at play to, in fact, feed into support for Tim Hudak.
And I think lack of frugality with public funds would be part of that?
I think there's no doubt that the concern about deficits, the concern about the economy, the concern that perhaps, I think part of it is the concern that McGuinty has kind of run out of steam, is unable to. And you see, that's not saying I'm all for a return to Mike Harris. What it is saying I just don't see too many alternatives. But I think that I agree that there is a hay to be made by mobilizing against public sector workers, not unions in particular. I think that's seriously mistaken. And I think Tim Hudak will play, if he's smart, not that I'm sure I would have no idea what his electoral campaign would be, but he wants to be careful. He doesn't want to attack the public too much because those are all the people that we rely on. On the other hand, he wants to undermine this notion that governments are in fact spendthrifts.
And every public sector worker delivers a public service. The healthcare, for example, is delivered by frontline workers.
Sure.
And you attack, but if you attack, you know, those who work in the hospitals, you're actually attacking the services that they deliver.
You don't attack,
and people get very skittish about that.
You don't attack the workers. You attack guys like Sid here, the union leaders. That's the political thing, isn't it? Of course, who can be against my son's teacher? Yeah. But those darn teacher unions, that's who I'm after.
And who wouldn't love Sid?
Well, and that's
tell me this.
But Jim actually
one second, just say, if you fired half the civil service, would you save a lot of money? Would you reduce the deficit?
No, if you're talking about, you know, the people down at the various blocks at Queen's Park, probably not. But I think that is part of the faceless bureaucracy. You can all run against them. No one loves them. I mean, rightly or wrongly, they do a great job, but if I'm going to go after the unions and go after public sector workers being paid too much and, you know, too high benefits, I'm not going to go after nurses and teachers. I'm going to go after these bureaucrats.
Okay, but even the Liberals, sorry, Harold, one more. But even the Liberals, I think last week, announced that they were shutting down, I think, a dozen agencies in the Ontario government, and they were going to save, you know, not having to pay whatever it was, 1,200 people. Now that's I mean, I know it's pittance, I understand that, but if you wanted to do that on a grander scale, could you save a lot of money?
Yeah, but I think you would do it for other reasons. You do it, if thinking from a conservative philosophy, you do it because I want to reduce the size of government. I want government having less influence.
But you wouldn't save money because you'd have to pay for those services from the private sector. I think this is where you wouldn't save money. But in fact, the other side of this is, something we haven't talked about is, this is not just about balancing the budget and so on. It's about an attack on what we understand as public goods. The fact that we don't believe that public goods should in fact be provided, that somehow we're better off by private goods. Whereas I think there is a large amount of the population
I don't agree at all.
that thinks that the public goods are absolutely
3 minutes left and I got to hear from Howard.
I don't agree at all. There's two aspects of it. First of all, you go after general profligacy. which Hudak's been doing and will continue to do.
Is there a lot of that?
A great deal of that.
General
That's
profligacy?
General profligacy in terms of government spending, and much of it is related to the union and employment and the numbers of employees and the amount they're being paid. And secondly, this amorphous concept that's got so much traction in Toronto and elsewhere that's moved forward to 60% of the most recent polls, called the gravy train, which is just the flip side of government profligacy. And you know what, Stephen? Even if there isn't government profligacy, which there is, there's a perception of it. And you don't go down. You don't go down to the gravamen. You don't go down to the details of we're going to let go this particular daycare worker or this particular.
But isn't one of the
OVP
lessons
officer.
here, and I don't want to get off track here, but you brought it up, isn't one of the lessons that we've discovered from Ford Nation that the gravy train really doesn't exist in the way people think, because now Mr. Ford is going to Queen's Park saying, I actually need 150 million provincial dollars to help balance my budget, because all the gravy we thought we'd find actually isn't there.
Well, he hasn't actually said that. He said that.
I know he hasn't said it, but that's the fact.
He's just started looking.
That's the perception.
It's
That's the
that
perception.
may be
And
the
perception is
perception. He
everything.
just started looking, and I suspect in a year from now, when you get to the next budget, he's only had a month or two, he's going to find lots of profligacy or gravy to eradicate.
In fact, instead he found a surplus that Miller was able to accumulate and use so that he could balance the budget
Well,
this year.
that's-
So in
that's
that
funny
sense,
money.
Yes.
I
Okay,
mean,
she's telling me I got 2 minutes left. Sid, start us off here. The future for Canada's public sector unions. Actually, let's not say Canada, let's say Ontario. How does it look right now?
I think we'll go through a rough period. There's no question in Toronto, for example, it may set the trend for the rest of the province. We know that Ford is coming in with a $770 million deficit and then add in inflation over the next little while. So you could be looking at $1 billion. Bargaining is about to start, and I think that could be very, very unsettling over the next number of months. And then that may spin off into Hamilton, Ottawa, and elsewhere. So in the short term, I think until Ford runs out of steam, and he will. I mean, we've seen this. I've been around a long time. I've seen politicians come and go, many premiers and so on. They come in very popular, and they have an agenda, and it just runs out of steam. So, yeah, give us a year or two, and Ford won't be nearly as popular as he is today. And I think we'll get back to a more stable equilibrium in the public sector. I see growth in the public sector, to be frank. I don't see us losing too many members over the next little while.
Okay, that's the last word on this program. Thanks to all of our guests for coming on today. Sid Ryan, President of the Ontario Federation of Labour. James Milway from the Martin Prosperity Institute. On the other side of the table, Charlotte Yates, Labour historian at McMaster University. Howard Levitt, National Post columnist and Labour lawyer. Good of all of you to join us tonight. Thanks so much.